Well, good evening, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Looking forward to seeing you all again this week. As always, it's great to see all of those that are tuning in. Grateful for your presence. We've got an interesting one tonight, and it's a good one, so we're going to dive straight into it. So, this one is called Horrid Red Things. Now, this is a fascinating little premise, and so I'm looking forward to explaining this because it's probably one of my favorite titles that if you don't know what he's talking about, totally throws you off completely. So let's dive right into this chapter from God in the Docks, Horrid Red Things. So, Horrid Red Things is an essay by C.S. Lewis, first published on October 6, 1944, in the Church of England newspaper. It was later included, as we're reading right now, in the collection God in the Dock, and it was also adapted into one of the chapters in Lewis's book Miracles when it was republished in 1947. So here's some background and context to this. Written during World War II, Horrid Red Things reflects Lewis's engagement with the intellectual and cultural challenges of presenting Christianity to a modern, often skeptical audience. Now, let's be honest, in our modern world 2025, same audience. Same audience with a little bit more tech understanding, but the reality is not much has changed. As a prominent Christian apologist, Lewis aimed to bridge the gap between faith and reason. He would do this quite a bit, addressing misunderstandings about religious language and imagery. The essay tackles the tension between scientific rationalism and Christian belief, particularly how literal interpretations of biblical imagery can obscure the deeper truths of faith. So Lewis wrote in a period when scientific advancements were reshaping public perceptions of the universe, often leading to a perceived conflict between science and religion. And so he's going to make sure that people understand that how you read the Bible matters, especially in light of modern scientific reasoning. And so the essay's title comes from an anecdote about a child who, warned about the dangers of poison, associate with horrid red things inside aspirin pills. So Lewis uses this kind of to illustrate how people often cling to misleading mental images when grappling with abstract concepts, including religious ones. And this is not something unique to the scientific world, but it's one to basically all people. That's something that might have happened in our own childhood or lives that gives us a mental image of something that may not be the reality. He argues that many objections to Christianity stem from mistaking symbolic or metaphorical language, God as Father or heaven as a physical place above, for literal descriptions. So Lewis distinguishes between thinking, grasping essential truths, and imagining, forming actual mental pictures, emphasizing that while imagery is necessary, it should not override the core beliefs. So the overall premise and argument is this. His overall argument in Horrid Red Things is that objections to Christianity often arise from mistaking its symbolic or metaphorical language for literal descriptions. He distinguishes between thinking and imagining, arguing that misleading mental images like a child's idea of a horrid red things and poison can distort understanding of religious concepts. So Lewis will go on to defend the supernatural elements of Christianity, particularly miracles, as literal truths that should not be reduced to mere metaphors or dismissed by scientific rationalism. Thus, he urges kind of the readers to focus on the core truths of faith rather than being sidetracked by literal interpretations of its imagery. Now, I will note that there is a lot of literal imagery and literal history that happens in throughout all of Scripture, but there is also what we would call both prophetic. There is apocalyptic literature. There are different aspects and styles of literature all throughout the Bible, whether it's historical in nature, and knowing how to read the Bible and how to view those different things and understand what they come from can help a reader. And that's really what Lewis is going to be getting at quite a bit. So let's look at Horrid Red Things. Many theologians and some scientists are now ready to proclaim that the 19th century conflict between science and religion is over and done with. But even if this is true, it is a truth known only to real theologians and real scientists. That is, a few highly educated men. To the man in the street, the conflict is still perfectly real, and in his mind it takes a form which the learned hardly dream of. I do love this. He acknowledges very openly the fact that, oh man, in the upper echelons at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and those schools, um, and I've had the blessings and the pleasure to attend one or two of those, and oh man, the eliteness of academia, where you hear people talk as if these things were already known and done with, but Lewis brings it back to reality, but the everyday man. That is not the reality for the everyday man. There's a lot of people who like to make absolute statements coming from the eliteness of academia, claiming that things are dead. God is dead and the rest. when the reality for everyday man is not the same. The ordinary man is not thinking of particular dogmas and particular scientific discoveries. What troubles him is an all pervading difference of atmosphere between what he believes Christianity to be and that general picture of the universe which he has picked up from living in a scientific age. He gathers from the creed that God has a son, just as if God were a god like Odin or Jupiter, that this son came down like a parachutist from heaven, first to earth and later to some land of the dead situated between the earth's surface, that still later he ascended into the sky and took his seat in a decorated chair placed a little to the right of his father's throne. The whole thing seems to imply a local and material heaven, a palace in the stratosphere, a flat earth, and all the rest of those archaic misconceptions. So here he's noting kind of, if you read the Bible literally, this is what the everyday man might often think. The ordinary man is well aware that we should deny all the beliefs he attributes to us and interpret our creed in a different sense. But this by no means satisfies him. No doubt he thinks, once those articles of belief are there, they can be all allegorized or spiritualized away to any extent you please. But is it not plain that there would never have been there at all if the first generation of Christians had had any notion of what the real universe is like? So basically saying, man, if they only knew what we knew today, they wouldn't have any of these notions. A historian who has based his work on the misreading of a document may afterwards, when his mistake has been exposed, exercise great ingenuity in showing that his account of a certain battle can still be reconciled with what the document records. But the point is that none of these ingenious explanations could ever have come into existence if he had read his documents correctly at the outset. They are therefore really a waste of labor. It would be manlier of him to admit his mistake and begin all over again. This is the plight of the academic who, when he writes his papers and says, I believe this to be true, and then he's found to have been wrong because he misread some historical aspect or documents, and instead of just admit it and say I was wrong and start over, goes, no, I must have been right in these things, and doubles down consistently. I think there are two things that Christians must do if they wish to convince this ordinary modern man. In the first place, they must make it quite clear that what will remain of the creed after all their explanations and reinterpretations will still be something quite unambiguously supernatural, miraculous, and shocking. Notice, he's not taking away from what the scriptures actually say. Scriptures are miraculous, supernatural, and shocking. We may not believe in a flat earth and a sky palace, but we must insist from the beginning that we believe as firmly as any savage or theosophist in a spirit world which can and does invade the natural or phenomenal universe. For the plain man suspects that when we start explaining, we are going to explain away, that we have mythology for our ignorant hearers and are ready, when cornered by educated hearers, to reduce it to innocuous moral platitudes which no one ever dreamed of denying. And there are theologians who justify this position. I know quite a few, in fact, in my own life today, who deny both the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, both the inspiration of Scripture, but you still claim to be Christians. They'll deny miracles. They'll deny the virgin birth. They'll deny Jesus is Lord. They'll deny all sorts of things and still claim to be Christian. From them we must part company, absolutely. If nothing remains except what could be equally well stated without Christian formula, then the honest thing is to admit that Christianity is untrue and to begin over again without it. In the second place, we must try to teach something about the difference between thinking and imagining. It is, of course, an historical error to suppose that all, or even most, early Christians believed in the sky palace in the same sense in which we believe in the solar system. Anthropomorphism was condemned by the church as soon as the creation question was explicitly before her. But some early Christians may have done this, and probably thousands never thought of their faith without anthropomorphic imagery. That is why we must distinguish the core of belief from the attendant imagining. So when you hear people talk about heaven, and when you hear people talk about a new earth, or when you hear people talk about those things, imagery comes into play. The imagination comes into play. This is what he's getting at. The imagination of a man doesn't necessarily make it true. That's the key. Just because the way one sees it or thinks he sees it, that's the way that it must be, is not necessarily the reality of what the scriptures actually say. When I think of London, I always see a picture of Euston Station, but I do not believe that London is Euston Station. That is a simple case, because then the thinker knows the imagery to be false. Now let us take a more complex one. I once heard a lady tell her daughter that if you ate too many aspirin tablets, you would die. But why? Asked the child. If you squash them, you don't find any horrid red things inside of them. By the way, that's where that comes from. Obviously, when this child thought of poison, she not only had an attendant image of horrid red things, but she actually believed that poison was red. And this is an error. But how far does it invalidate her thinking about poison? She learned that an overdose of aspirin would kill you. Her belief is true. She knew within limits which of the substances in her mother's house were poisonous. If I, staying in the house, had raised a glass of what looked like water to my lips and the child had said, "Don't drink that, Mummy says it's poisonous," I should have been foolish to disregard the warning on the ground that, well, this child has an archaic and mythological idea of poison as horrid red things. There is thus a distinction not only between thought and imagination in general, but even between thought and those images which the thinker falsely believes to be true. When the child learned later that poison is not always red, she would not have felt that anything essential in her beliefs about poison had been altered. She would still know, as she had always known, that poison is what kills you if you swallow it. That is the essence of poison. The erroneous beliefs about color drop away without affecting it. So even the imagination, as he's describing it, doesn't necessarily affect the actual truth of what it was that she believed. In the same way, an early peasant Christian might have thought the Christ sitting at the right hand of the Father really implied two chairs in a state in a certain spatial relation inside a sky palace. So he's literally saying, an early Christian may have literally thought in the sky that there was sitting above, there's a heaven right above the clouds, literally right above the clouds. There's a physical place, heaven and the rest, and there's a throne and God, and Jesus is sitting next to it, right next to God. But in the same man afterwards received a philosophical education and discovered that God has no body parts or passions, and therefore neither a right hand nor a palace, he would not have felt that the essentials of his belief had been altered. What had mattered to him, even the days of his simplicity, had not been supposed details about celestial furniture. It had been the assurance that the once crucified master was now the supreme agent or the unimaginable power on whom the whole universe depends. And he would recognize that in this he had never been deceived. The critic may still ask us why the imagery, which we admit to be untrue, should be used at all. Now, I do want to note when he says which would mean it to be untrue, it would be untrue in the sense that it was used as a descriptive aspect. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. It may not be true in a physical sense the way we talk about it, but it doesn't mean that its actual validity is untrue. But he has not noticed that any language we attempt to substitute for it would involve imagery that is open to all the same objections. So even if we tried to describe it in its actual way, you think of Revelation, the way John writes about how what he was seeing, and he's using only the terms and the things that we could we in our own minds could visualize from a physical being as we are, even though we are spiritual in nature. A spiritual world is hard for us to conceptualize, even imagine at times. To say that God enters the natural order involves just as much spatial imagery as to say that he comes down. One has simply substituted horizontal or undefined for vertical movement. To say that he is reabsorbed into noumenal is better than to say he ascended into heaven, only if the picture of something dissolving in warm fluid or being sucked into a throat is less misleading than the picture of a bird or a balloon going up. All language, except about objects of sense, is metaphorical through and through. To call God a force that is something like a wind or a dynamo is a metaphorical as to call him father or a king. On such matters, we can make our language more polysyllabic or duller. We cannot make it more literal. The difficulty is not peculiar to theologians. Scientists, poets, psychoanalysts, and metaphysicians are all in the same boat. Man's reason is in such deep insolvency to sense. We are bound by what we see, hear, touch, feel, and so forth. Where, then, do we draw the line between explaining and explaining away? I do not think there is much difficulty. All that concerns the unincarnate activities of God, his operation on that plane of being where sense cannot enter, must be taken along with imagery which we know to be, in the literal sense, untrue. But there can be no defense for applying the same treatment to the miracles of the incarnate God. Now, this is an important part. They are recorded as events on this earth which affected human senses. They are the sort of thing we can describe literally. If Christ turned water into wine, and we had been present, we could have seen, smelled, and tasted. The story that he did so is not of the same order as his sitting at the right hand of the Father. And either fact or legend, or it is either fact or legend or lie. You must take it or leave it. So one of my favorite things about this writing is how he breaks down this entire argument and gets down to just the very premise of either the physical things that happened on the earth and in the Bible and the rest are true or not. but he's also making sure that we don't get to a point where our imaginations on things that are outside of our understanding automatically mean that what we're reading is not true. And that's the key component to this all. So thank you all for being with me tonight. I love you all. I'm grateful for your presence consistently. Look forward to seeing you all next week. If you have any questions, as always, let me know where you're coming from, but also send me your questions. I'll be more than happy to answer them whenever I can. Hope you have a fantastic, fantastic night. We'll see you all next week.